Renata Mori's father's order was supreme law, written in blood. 1 page. His handwriting in the margin. Vale. No exceptions. She signed it the day after the funeral. He wrote the name. She added the date. 6 years later, she hasn't touched that drawer. Until this morning. Her assistant slides a referral letter across the desk. The name? Soren Vale. She reads it. Then again. She picks up the phone. Send him in at 2. He arrives exactly on time. That's the first thing she knows. She's already seated, hands perfectly still. 6 years of running the Mori syndicate has taught her one principle. Every name has a consequence. Soren Vale sits, meets her eyes, and waits. He doesn't look like a man in danger. That's the second thing she knows. His application is on the table, his death warrant is in the drawer. And the man? He just sat down to ask for a job, to see which document she pulls out first. Like this video. Subscribe and turn on the notification bell right now. Sovereign obsession is a game of high stakes, and in this room, the first one to blink loses everything. The interview is about to begin. The lift opens onto the executive floor. Milan spreads below, winter white and flat, the city pressing against glass on 3 sides. Her assistant falls into step beside her. He's already in the lobby, standing, didn't sit down. She files it, walks into the boardroom. 2 cups of coffee wait on the table. Her assistant set them there. She sits with her back to the window, the city behind her, the referral letter closed between the cups. Soren Vale enters at exactly 2 o'clock. He is taller than the Kellner photograph, broader through the shoulders. He moves with the economy of a man who has learned to take up exactly the space a room requires, and no more. He doesn't look at the view. He doesn't look at the room. He looks at her. He sits. She does not offer her hand. He does not extend his. The cups sit between them, cooling. You were referred by the Kellner Group. I worked their Vienna desk for 2 years. Network architecture, counterintelligence mapping. They believed my methodology might suit a private syndicate expanding its intelligence infrastructure. Your methodology. Pattern recognition across financial and personnel networks. I identify structural vulnerabilities before they become exposure events. She asks 4 technical questions. He answers all of them, fully, accurately, without notes. Genuine competence or performance engineered for this room. Both possibilities stay open. Then the 5th question. Your last private contract, before Kellner. Walk me through it. A pause. Half a second. Most people would miss it. She doesn't. Proprietary engagement, he says. Confidentiality terms still active. Too smooth. Too ready. He knew that question was coming. He prepared the answer before he walked through the door. She picks up the referral letter, sets it down. 2-week trial placement. Monday. He accepts without negotiating. A man who doesn't negotiate his own terms either has nothing to lose or has already decided the terms don't matter. She stands. He stands a half second after, calibrated. She walks to the door first. She does not look back. But 20 minutes later, alone at her desk, the second drawer still closed, she is already cataloging the pause on question 5. He knew it was coming. The only question remaining is how. He worked like a man who already knew where everything was kept. The first vulnerability he found was in the Mori Northern exposure, a gap in the counterparty verification chain on a series of Zurich instruments that her internal team had flagged as low risk 18 months ago and filed accordingly. Soren found it on day 3. He didn't come to her with it. He left a single-page analysis on her desk before she arrived, the problem mapped and the resolution outlined in 4 steps. She read it twice. The second vulnerability was deeper, a personnel dependency in the London desk that created a single point of failure if 2 specific analysts were removed simultaneously. Found on day 6, same delivery, on her desk before morning. The third was in the digital architecture of the Mori surveillance network. A sequencing flaw that under specific triggering conditions would create a 72-hour blind spot in the Eastern European monitoring chain. Day 9, same method. 3 vulnerabilities in 9 days that her internal team, 12 people with combined decades of experience, had missed entirely. She called her head of internal security into her office on day 10. He's either exceptional, she said, or he already knew where to look. Those aren't mutually exclusive, Ms. Mori. She dismissed him. The Vitaly intelligence drops began on day 8. The first was a single document, a shell company registration in Luxembourg she hadn't previously connected to the Vitaly network. Clean, sourced, accurate. She cross-referenced it against 3 independent nodes it held. On day 10, a second document. Day 12, a third. Each one a piece of something larger, each one stopping just short of the next logical disclosure. She understood the sequencing. She let it continue. On day 11, she arrived at her desk at 7:15 to find coffee waiting. Ceramic cup, no sleeve, temperature exactly where she takes it, just below scalding, no milk, no sugar. Her assistant hadn't arrived yet. The coffee was already there. She stood in the doorway for a moment. Then she sat down, moved the cup to the left side of the desk and opened her first file of the morning. She did not acknowledge it when Soren passed her office at 8 o'clock. But she filed it the way she catalogs everything without an immediate explanation, held still in a column of its own, waiting for the pattern to complete. He had studied her before he walked in. He wasn't concealing it. He was letting her see it. She could not yet answer why a man would make himself this visible. In this building, in this office, to this particular woman. And sit there, composed and unhurried as if visibility were not a liability. As if he had already calculated the risk and decided it was one he was willing to carry. Her father built things to last. She built things to win. Soren named the difference before she asked. The council meeting convened at 9 on a Thursday morning in the Mori boardroom. The same glass room, cleared now of interview furniture, replaced by the long mahogany table her father had shipped from Florence the year she turned 10. 7 men. 3 of them her father's original appointments. 2 hers. One of them. Berto Canali, head of the Northern Operations Desk. She had been watching for 11 weeks. Soren sat to her left, one position back from the table. Not at it. Her intelligence aide was not a council member, and she had not offered the distinction. He had not asked for it. He brought a single leather notebook, opened it once at the start of the meeting, and did not write in it again. She watched him not write. He was listening the way she listened. Not to the words, but to the intervals between them. What people paused on. What they moved past too quickly. What they said when they were trying to sound like they were saying something else. The meeting lasted 2 hours. Quarterly position reviews, a disputed asset in the Geneva portfolio, a personnel restructure in Rome. Canali spoke 4 times. Each contribution was measured, lateral and unremarkable, nothing that would register to anyone not already watching him. Afterward, the council dispersed into the corridor. She walked Soren to the secondary lift, the one opening onto the private floor, away from the main executive traffic, and waited until the corridor cleared. Canali, Soren said. Not a question, said the way you name something already decided. The third time he spoke, he said, he cited a figure from the Geneva portfolio review that wasn't in the distributed materials. He corrected himself immediately. But the figure was accurate. It matched the internal-only summary that went to 3 people in this building. You, your CFO, and Canali himself. She had caught the figure. She had not caught the correction. You're certain? I'm certain of the figure. You'll verify the rest. She already was in the part of her mind that runs parallel to every conversation. Cross-referencing the timeline, the access logs, the sequence of Vitaly intelligence she had been mapping for 3 weeks. If Canali was the feed, the sequencing held. The pieces landed in an order that pointed directly upward from him. Thank you, she said. The words felt insufficient. They were also precise. He nodded once and stepped into the lift. She stood in the corridor after the doors closed. He had brought it without being asked. In 6 years of running the Mori syndicate, no one had ever done that. She filed it in a column she did not yet have a name for. Same handwriting, different sentence, same problem. The archive session began at 7 in the evening and was meant to last 2 hours. By 10 o'clock they were still at the table, 6 years of Vitaly positioning documents spread across the surface in a sequence that was beginning, finally, to resolve into a shape. Soren worked the way he did everything. Quietly, methodically, without announcing what he was doing until it was done. He moved documents left to right, oldest to newest, building a timeline on the mahogany that her internal team had never assembled because they had never treated the pieces as a single architecture. She worked the opposite end. Financial instruments first, then personnel movements, then the shell company registrations he had been feeding her one per session for 3 weeks. At 10:14, he slid a document across the table. This one. It was a Vitally asset assessment from 6 years ago. Standard positioning document, the kind that circulated internally during acquisition planning. She had seen the document before. She had not seen the copy he was holding. This one had margin notes. Her father's handwriting. Blue ink, slightly pressed. He always pressed harder when he was thinking through something complex, the pen dragging rather than flowing. They move slow. Wait them out. The patient hand wins. She read it once. The room did not change. The documents were still spread across the table. Soren was still across from her, his hand resting near the edge of the page. Outside, Milan moved through its ordinary night. She read it again. Same handwriting that had written Vale. No exceptions. On the order she had found the day after the funeral, still sitting on his desk, as if he had stepped out for a moment and would be back to finish it. The hand she had completed with a date because she did not know yet. Did not know she was allowed to know. That she could have set the pen down. 6 years of running this syndicate on his logic, his frameworks, his margin notes. Consulted or remembered or inherited so deeply, she could no longer tell the difference between his judgment and her own. She felt Soren go still across the table. He had seen her face. He did not ask. He did not look up. He moved to the next document. She let him. Later. Much later. Alone at her desk. She sat with what the margin note had confirmed. She had not been running the Mori syndicate. She had been running her father's version of it, narrated in his voice, executed in his hand. The patient hand wins. She had waited 6 years. For the Vitales. For clarity. For permission she never knew she was waiting for. The question she could not answer yet was whose patience she had actually been practicing. The problem wasn't that she trusted him. The problem was that she'd stopped checking whether she should. 3 weeks into Soren's placement, she restructured her working schedule without deciding to. The morning briefings that had always run through her head of internal security began routing through Soren first. Not formally, not by directive, but because his reads were faster, more granular, and arrived before she asked for them. The Vitali mapping sessions that had begun at 7 in the evening were now running until midnight. She had stopped telling her assistant to book the car for 10:30. She noticed this on a Wednesday in the 3rd week and did not change it. The professional architecture was intact. Every interaction was transactional, every exchange documented, every session logged. She had not breached a single protocol she had established for managing an intelligence asset. The distance was maintained technically, precisely, at every visible level. It was the invisible level she had stopped monitoring. She discovered this on a Thursday evening, 40 minutes into a Vitali financial modeling session, when she made an error. It was small. A transposition in a counterparty identifier that produced a marginal discrepancy in the instrument sequencing. The kind of error that cascades invisibly through a model if uncaught, surfacing 3 steps later as something that doesn't reconcile and requires an hour to trace back. She had not made an error of this kind in 4 years. She did not catch it. She moved on. She was 2 steps further into the model when she noticed the document on Soren's side of the table had shifted slightly. She looked at his version of the shared file on the screen between them. He had corrected it. No annotation, no comment in the margin, no flag in the tracking column. The identifier was simply correct, as if it had always been correct, as if the error had never existed. She looked at him. He was reading the next section of the model, one hand flat on the table, unhurried. He had caught it before she did. He had corrected it without making her aware she needed correcting. He had protected her from her own imperfection without creating a moment she would have to receive. She looked back at her screen. Outside the error. Now resolved. Now invisible. The model held. She did not say anything. Neither did he. The session continued for another 40 minutes and closed without reference to what had happened. Walking back through the empty building at midnight, she catalogued it the way she catalogued everything she could not immediately categorize. Held still, assigned to a column she still had not named, waiting for the pattern to finish. What she knew was this. The men in her world managed assets. They extracted, negotiated, leveraged, and when an asset showed weakness, they noted it and filed it for later use. That was the logic of this world. That was the logic she had inherited and scaled and run without exception for 6 years. Soren had seen a weakness and buried it. That was not asset management. She did not yet have a name for what it was. Someone told the Vitalis he was back. She had 48 hours before the position triggered. The alert came from her Frankfurt node at 6 in the morning, a monitoring flag on a Vitali-adjacent shell company that had been dormant for 11 months. Movement in the overnight window, instrument reclassification, pre-trigger sequencing. She was at her desk by 6:15. By 7 she had confirmed 3 things. The Vital debt position was accelerating, the trigger sequence had been initiated, and the accelerant was information. Specifically the information that Soren Vale had reappeared in the orbit of the Mori syndicate. Canali. She had removed his access 6 days ago. Quietly, procedurally, without confrontation. Not quietly enough. She had 48 hours, possibly less. She did not call her head of security. She did not convene the council. She walked to the secondary boardroom where Soren had been working since 7, pushed the door open without knocking and stood in the threshold. He looked up, took one look at her face, closed the file he was working on. She told him what she knew. The Frankfurt flag, the trigger sequence, the 48-hour window. The map was incomplete. She had 70%, enough to understand the architecture but not enough to dismantle it before the position triggered. She needed the rest. She said this the way she had not spoken to him in 6 weeks of managed professional distance. Directly. Without performance. Without the register she used when she was extracting from an asset. The way she spoke when something mattered, and there was no longer time to speak any other way. He was quiet for a moment. He gave her the rest of the map. All of it. At once. "Why are you giving me all of it now?" she asked. "No sequencing." "Because you just asked me like you needed it," he said. "Instead of like you were managing me. That's a different question." She absorbed this, filed it, moved immediately. He pulled the complete architecture. Every shell company, every instrument, every counterparty dependency, the full trigger sequence and the 4 points in that sequence where a Mori counter instrument, correctly positioned, could collapse the entire position before execution. 4 hours later those instruments were in position. She worked through the afternoon without stopping. Soren worked beside her. Not as an aide, not as an asset, but as the only other person in the building who understood the full map they were building against. At 4:15 he brought coffee. Same temperature. Same cup. She did not acknowledge it. But somewhere between the Frankfurt flag at 6 in the morning and the last counter instrument placed at 9 in the evening, she registered what he had told her. "You just asked me like you needed it." What he meant. What she did not yet fully hear was that he had been waiting. Not for the right moment. For her. For the version of her that asked without performing. For the version that arrived when there was no longer time to be anything but real. She filed it in the column that still had no name. It was getting full. She rules Mori's empire on managing every variable. He just told her she had been managing him, and he had been waiting for her to stop. The Vitali position triggers in 48 hours. The building has been compromised, and the man sitting across from her knew. Before he walked in. Before the interview, before any of this, exactly what she was holding in that second drawer. If you have made it this far, thank you for sticking around. Make sure you are subscribed. Because what happens in the next 48 hours inside this building is not something you want to find out late. Hit the like button. Comment where you're watching from. We need to know how far this story reaches. She didn't fight the Vitale position. She made it eat itself. The trigger came at 2 in the morning. She was already at her desk. The Vitale sequence initiated across 4 shell entities simultaneously. Luxembourg, Cyprus, the Cayman instrument, and a Geneva holding she had not previously connected to the main position. The 4th entity was the one that would have broken the model if Soren hadn't given her the complete map 18 hours earlier. She had a counter instrument on it. She triggered it first. The sequence logic was simple in principle and brutal in execution. The Vitali position was built on a chain of dependencies. Each instrument assumed the one before it would hold. She was not going to fight the chain. She was going to remove the 3rd link and let the weight of the chain destroy the rest of itself. She worked in silence. Soren tracked the cascade on the secondary system across the table, calling position movements in a low, flat voice as they broke across the network. Not asking for direction, reading the board and reporting, letting her work. At 3:40, the Cyprus instrument collapsed. At 4:05, Luxembourg followed. At 4:19, her phone showed the Geneva position going to 0. She was watching the Cayman instrument. The last link, the heaviest. When the building alert sounded, not a digital flag, a physical alarm, her head of security on the line in 3 seconds, 2 vehicles in the underground, 4 men, armed. The Vitalis had sent a contingency. She stood, reached for the desk drawer. The right-hand one, where she kept the secondary comms unit for exactly this protocol. She had the unit in her hand when Soren was already at the door, not moving toward her, moving past her, into the corridor. He already knew the building's secondary exit routing. She had not told him. He had learned it the way he learned everything else, before she thought to wonder if he needed to. "Stay behind me," he said. Not a request. She followed. Not because he told her to, because he was already moving in the right direction and there was no time to establish who had given what order. The next 11 minutes were precise and without hesitation on his part. 2 of the 4 men encountered in the corridor. Soren moved through both engagements with the economy of someone who had mapped the variables before they materialized. She watched him and understood, with a clarity that the professional distance of the past 6 weeks had been carefully preventing her from reaching, that he had known this was coming. He had positioned himself for it. Not tonight. Before the interview. Before the referral letter landed on her desk. He had come back knowing she held a warrant with his name on it, and knowing the Vitali network would eventually send men to the building. He had come back and placed himself between her and both of those things. At 4:41, the Cayman instrument went to 0. The Vitali position was gone. She stood in the corridor of her own building, the city coming up gray and quiet outside the high windows, and looked at the man who had moved before she gave any order. The bottom of her professional framework dropped 1 inch. Irreversible. She almost said my father would have. She stopped. She didn't know how it ended. That had never happened before. They were back on the executive floor by 5 in the morning. The building was being swept by her security team. The Vitali network, stripped of its financial position and its contingency operations simultaneously, was a problem for lawyers now. Hers, and eventually theirs. It was over. She poured 2 glasses of water from the credenza by the window. She set one in front of him. She sat across the table, not behind her desk, across from him, the way she had sat 6 weeks ago when he walked in at 2 o'clock and she poured coffee she hadn't told anyone to make warm. "Why did you come back?" He had the glass in both hands. He looked at it for a moment. "The Vitali network burned me," he said. "You know that part. I know that part. I could have sent the map anonymously. Courier, encrypted drop, a dozen ways to deliver it without walking into this building." He set the glass down. "I came in person because there was only one person I trusted to use it correctly, and I had spent 6 years trying to understand what it meant that the person I trusted most was the one holding a warrant with my name on it." She said nothing. "I needed to know," he said, "if you'd sign it again. As yourself. Knowing what you know now." The room was very quiet. Outside, the first gray light of Milan was beginning at the edge of the skyline. "He wrote the name," she said finally. "I added the date. The day after the funeral. I didn't deliberate, I didn't decide. I completed it the way you complete the next item on a list when you don't yet know you're allowed to leave it blank." A pause. "I have spent 6 years telling myself that order was his. It has my signature on it." She looked at the glass in front of her. "I was 28 years old. I didn't know yet that I was allowed to put the pen down." She almost said, "My father would have known what to do with this morning." The sentence was already forming. The familiar reach for his logic, his framework, his margin notes running in her mind like an operating system she had never chosen to install. She stopped. The sentence did not complete. She waited for the ending to arrive, the way it always had. His voice in her reasoning, his judgment in her conclusions. The inherited certainty that had carried her through 6 years of decisions she had believed were hers. It did not come. She was sitting in a building she ran, across from a man whose death she had authorized and then not authorized, and then kept in a drawer for 6 years while she finished her father's sentences, and she did not know what her father would have done with any of it. She had run out of sentence. Soren watched her stop. He did not speak. He did not move to fill what she had left open. He sat with her in the incomplete thought and let it be hers. The not knowing, the open space where the inherited conclusion had always arrived before. He let it be hers. She looked up at him. "I'm not going to sign it again," she said. Not a declaration, not a pronouncement. Quiet, specific, arrived at from nothing but herself. "I know," he said. Her first decision as Dawn. She unmade it in the morning light 6 years later, as herself. She waited until the security sweep was complete and the building had settled back into its ordinary silence. Soren was at the secondary table with the remnants of the Vitale documentation, organizing what would need to go to her legal team. She watched him for a moment from the doorway of her office. Then she sat at her desk and opened the second drawer. The manila folder was behind the false back, exactly where she had placed it 6 years ago. She did not need to move anything to find it. She had always known exactly where it was. She set it on the desk. "Soren." He looked up. She gestured once. "Come here." And he crossed the room and stood across from her, not sitting, standing. As if he understood this was not a conversation that required settling into. She opened the folder. One page. Her father's handwriting. Vale. No exceptions. Below it, in her own hand. Tighter, younger, pressed harder than she presses now. The date. The day after the funeral. The day she had stood at her father's desk in this building, in this office, and reached for the pen because she did not know what else to reach for. She told him this, plainly without performance, the way she had spoken at 5 in the morning when the building was quiet and there was nothing left to manage. She told him she had read it once, the day after the funeral, and signed it before she understood she was signing anything. That she had kept it in the drawer for 6 years because destroying it meant her first act as Dawn was something she had chosen to undo, and she had not been ready to be a person who unmade her own decisions. She was ready now. She destroyed the page, closed the folder, placed it back in the drawer, closed the drawer, picked up the next file on her desk, and stopped. The reach happened before she caught it. The automatic movement toward her father's logic, the familiar consulting of inherited judgment. What would he do with this file? What would he do with this morning? The question she had asked 10,000 times without knowing she was asking it. She caught it this time, held it still, waited. Nothing came. The margin notes were gone. The operating system she had run on for 6 years, his frameworks, his voice, his hand in her reasoning, was no longer there. She had burned the last page of it 30 seconds ago. What remained was not freedom. Not yet. It was vertigo. The specific, unperformed disorientation of a woman standing in a self she had not yet furnished. She had dismantled the inherited architecture without knowing what she was building in its place. She did not know yet what her judgment looked like when it was only hers. She made one decision. Small. A routing call on the Frankfurt account, procedural, the kind of thing she had done without thinking for 6 years. She made it from nothing but herself. Her own read. Her own conclusion. No father in the reasoning. She did not know if it was right. That uncertainty was new. It was also, underneath everything, quiet enough that she almost didn't recognize it. The first thing that had ever been entirely hers. Soren had not moved. He stood across from her and did not speak and did not fill the silence. He let it belong to her. She looked at him. She looked back at the file. She turned the page. She destroyed the only thing that proved she had ever been someone else's instrument. She made one decision. Small, procedural, entirely hers. And did not know if it was right. That uncertainty was new. That is not the end of Renata Mori. That is the first morning of her. If this story held you, if you felt the weight of that second drawer, if you understood what it costs to stop completing someone else's sentences, then you are already part of this empire. Subscribe to Sovereign Obsession. Turn on the bell. Every story we tell is built for the woman in the room who sees more than she says. Drop "She turned the page" in the comments with your city. Tell us the moment you knew Renata was never going to sign it again. And if you want to know which woman we follow next, Which name? Which empire? Which man who walked in thinking he had the advantage? Stay on this channel. The next story is already waiting.